Well, for me, I was at the Kennedy Space Center to see the launch of STS-51L, the space shuttle mission that carried teacher Krista McAuliffe. And I was a regular attendee at shuttle launches. I would cover it for different newspapers and magazines. But this one was special as I was one of the finalists in the Teacher in Space program, as I like to say, my thinner day. So it was a day of celebration.
Coming up on the 7-minute point in the countdown.
This mission was cast as kind of the future of space exploration. Up to that time, you were a professional astronaut, usually a pilot, but we'd started flying mission specialists and payload specialists who had scientific backgrounds. We had flown a senator, we had flown a congressman, Bill Nelson from Florida, who was a congressman at the time, Jake Garn, Senator Garn from Utah. And so there was a feeling that things were changing, that space was becoming open to the everyday person. And of course, Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, his vision was to get a teacher up and an artist and a journalist, different flights, to express the beauty of space, the actual happenings that went on in kind of everyday language that people would understand.
Liquid oxygen ullage pressure checks are underway.
One of the nice things about being at the press site or being next door with the teachers in space is that they had these monitors that would show a variety of close-ups of the orbiter. And you saw these huge icicles hanging off the shuttle, and you kept on thinking, they're really not going to fly that. What happens if a piece of ice comes off and damages the tank or whatever? None of us knew at the time about the concerns that had been raised by the engineers the night before, that the weather was going to be too cold, that you could have an accident. They'd already had issues with the solid rocket booster O-ring burn-throughs. But we weren't privy, no one was really privy at the time to all that information. But just looking at the shuttle and seeing this ice, these huge icicles hanging off the orbiter, hanging off the solid rocket boosters, hanging off the external tank, it really, people were concerned. It was a little bit of apprehension and almost maybe a little bit of thought of what was going to come because of looking at the orbiter and the ice hanging off of it. But nonetheless, I think most of us were confident once the countdown resumed that we were going to see a successful flight and Krista would shortly be in orbit. Those of us who have been to launch just say it's like taking your hands and hitting yourself in the chest, and that's what it feels like. And it's so loud that you can almost be shouting to the person who's next to you and they can't hear you. So it's quite a sight and quite a sound to watch the orbiter lift off. And this one was no different. It was beautifully clear skies, cold, beautifully clear skies. Engines fired up, pre-hydrogen burn at T-minus 9 seconds. 3 main engines came on, everything seemed fine, and the 2 solids ignited at T-minus 0 and off the orbiter went.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
73 seconds later, you think about that and you think that it was something so simple that kind of the average, and I mean this in great respect, the average automobile mechanic knew about what happens when you take rubber, very inexpensive part, but very important, and you get it really extremely cold. It becomes brittle. And that's what basically had happened. The solid rocket boosters were segmented, they were stacked. And so to seal between each of the segments, they used rubber O-rings. Very inexpensive, very effective. But what happened is those O-rings got so cold, number one. Number two, apparently that particular stack, as we reused the solid rocket boosters, was maybe just a little bit out of round. And so you didn't have a perfect seal, and you had very cold weather, so the rubber became very brittle. When liftoff occurred, unbeknownst to everybody at the time, you had a blow through. That is, the pressure from ignition blew through that solid rocket booster at that point where it's a little bit out around and the rubber was cold. Well, what happened is that blow through happened. It took about 73 seconds for that to become more like a torch. That torch was unfortunately pointing right at the external tank, the tank that fuels the 3 main engines on the orbiter. containing hydrogen and oxygen, and that blowtorch caused the tank to disrupt, which then broke apart the orbiter. The two solid rocket boosters, including the one that was the problem, continue to arc away, and that's what you usually see. You see this huge puff, and then you see the two SRBs arcing away, and they destroyed those downrange a little bit further. So I think lessons learned is that space is dangerous. Don't get arrogant and cocky, because when you do, that's when you're going to get bit by an accident. And when you take all that into consideration, as we look at continuing to have astronauts aboard the International Space Station, going back to the moon, going to an asteroid. And I know that as we have a lot of private ventures with human space exploration, it's going to be interesting to see how they address these safety factors.